Her cousin sold her songs as his own, and the young woman sat silent at the keyboard while a room full of strangers praised the music, and never once said that the music was hers. And they would not have believed her if she had, for they had been told she could not speak at all. They had taken her house and her fortune and the name her father gave her, and when even that was not enough, they had found a way to take the one thing she had thought no one could reach, which was the work of her own mind, and Marian Ashby let them, and kept her face still, and went on writing in the cold by candlelight the songs that were sold by day under another man's name, because she had learned that a wronged woman with no money and no protector and no voice the world would credit has exactly two possessions left to her: her silence and her work, and she did not yet know that one of them was about to give the other back to her. It was a bright cold afternoon in the first week of April when the cold Earl of Wickham came to Thornleigh to meet the famous composer. And that afternoon is where I will begin, though Marian's story begins long before it, for everything that had been done to her over 3 slow years was about to be undone by a single melody and a man exacting enough to truly listen to it. I have been waiting a long time to tell you Marian's story, the whole of it, the robbery and the silence and the stolen songs and the cold proud man who came to praise a thief and stayed to find the truth. So settle in, and stay close by her side through what is coming, because a woman who has been counted as nothing for 3 years, and made to sit and smile at the theft of her own soul, is about to be made plain before the very people who could not be troubled to ask her a single question, and what she does when at last her name comes up out of the music, and what the man who first pitied her does when he learns whose mind he has been admiring all along, is a thing worth staying for to the very end. But to understand how the truest musician in the county came to be sitting silent at the instrument while a room full of fashionable people praised her own stolen work, you have to understand what had been done to Marian Ashby, and what she had been told she was, and what the world had been made to believe of her, for the better part of 3 long years. She had been the only child of Mr. Edmund Ashby of Thornleigh, the celebrated music master of the county and a gentleman of an old comfortable family, and she had grown up the cherished heiress of a handsome estate, with the run of a fine music room and a long light gallery where her father kept his instruments and his bound scores, and the unthinking certainty of the well-loved child that the world was a safe place, and that she was somebody in it. Her mother had died when Marian was small, and so it had been father and daughter together at Thornleigh through her growing up, close as a bow and the string it draws, and Mr. Ashby had raised her himself, and had done one thing for his daughter that no one else in the county would have thought to do for a girl. He had seen when she was very young that she had it, that rare thing, the true ear and the making mind, that she could hear a phrase once and set it down whole. And better, could hear a phrase that was not yet anywhere in the world, and bring it into being. And instead of calling it a pretty accomplishment and steering her toward the harp and the netting box, he had taken it seriously. He had taught her thoroughbass and counterpoint and the old severe disciplines that the fashionable masters had let fall. And then, when she had outrun even what he could teach, he had let her teach him, and had sat by her at the keyboard in the long evenings while she made things he had never heard, and had told her, more than once in the plain certain voice she remembered all her life, that a true voice was a kind of honesty, that anyone might learn the tricks of composition, but that the truth in a piece of music came up out of the person who made it and could not be faked or bought or stolen, and that she had it, and must never let anyone tell her she did not. She had believed him, because she was happy, and because it was true. But there was a shadow over that happy childhood, and it had fallen early. When Marian was 7, a fever had taken her, the same low, cruel fever that had carried off 2 children in the village that winter, and she had lived to her father's unspeakable relief, but it had left its mark, not on her ear, which was perfect, nor on her hands, which were quick and sure, but on her tongue. From that winter she stammered, not always, and not at home where she was easy, but in any strange company before any face she did not trust. The words would lock in her throat, and the harder she reached for them the faster they fled, until she would stand crimson and mute and helpless, while a sentence she knew perfectly well refused to be spoken. She learned, as such children do, to say little and to choose her moments. And at home, with her father, she could speak as freely as anyone, but in the wide world of the county, at the assembly and the dinner and the morning call, Marian Ashby was known as the music master's poor silent daughter, the girl who could not get a word out, and the county, which is not cruel so much as lazy, decided long before she was grown that there was probably not a great deal going on. Behind so quiet a face, her father knew better, and her father had defended her, and while her father lived, the silence was only a sorrow and not a danger. He had given her the keyboard as her voice, and it was a better voice than most people's tongues. For at the instrument the stammer fell away entirely, and the girl who could not order a cup of tea in company could sit down before a roomful of strangers and play them into perfect silence, and say with her hands everything her mouth could not. And she composed. By the time she was 20, Marian Ashby could write a song that broke the heart and a sonata you could lose yourself inside. And she signed each finished work the same way her father had taught her. Not on the page where any eye could find it, but inside the music itself, woven secret and certain into an inner voice where it lived as a part of the very fabric of the thing. A small recurring figure of 4 notes that, in the old German way of naming the notes that her father loved, spelled out the letters of her own name. It was a private honesty. He had told her, the composer's true signature, the one no copyist could scrape away and no rival could claim, because to remove it you would have to unmake the music, and a man who could unmake the music would not have needed to steal it. She had no notion then of selling anything. A gentleman's daughter did not publish under her own name. She made music for love and for her father's pleasure, and it filled the house at Thornleigh. And that was the whole of her ambition. And it was enough. And then, in the space of a single terrible year, the whole of that safe world came apart. The first blow was the one she had not seen coming at all, which was that her father, a man not yet old, had begun to fail, and the second, which she saw coming and was helpless to stop, was that into the long anxious months of his illness there came his brother. His name was Mr. Vincent Ashby, Edmund's younger brother, a smooth, plausible, ambitious man who had spent a comfortable life spending more than he had, and who arrived at Thornleigh when the news of his brother's illness reached him with every appearance of fraternal devotion and the cold private calculation of a man who has at last seen his chance. He brought with him his only son, Cecil, a handsome, idle, charming young man of 23 with his father's plausible tongue and none of his father's energy, who had been bred to expect a fortune and was beginning to be uneasily aware that there was none coming to him by the ordinary road. The two of them settled into Thornleigh, and made themselves useful, and were charming to the dying man and kind, in a careless public way, to his afflicted daughter. And they watched, and they waited, and they laid their plans. For Vincent Ashby had understood 2 things very quickly. He had understood that his brother's whole fortune, the estate and the funds and the famous collection, would pass to a girl who could not say 3 words together before a stranger and had not a friend in the world to act for her. And he had understood that a girl in such a case, properly managed, properly spoken for, might be made to disappear entirely behind the people who spoke for her. What Vincent Ashby took, he took the way clever cold people take, with patience and paper and a perfect smooth surface. There was a deed, it would later be sworn, a deed of guardianship drawn up, it was given out, in those last soft confused months, by which the failing Mr. Edmund Ashby, anxious above all for his helpless daughter, had committed her person and her whole fortune to the care and management of his trusted brother Vincent, to hold and administer for her during her natural life, she being by reason of her infirmity unfit to manage her own affairs. Marian, who was 20 and motherless and grief-stricken and silent, with her one old ally, her father's solicitor, mysteriously turned away from the door, did not know how to fight it, and did not in those first stunned months even fully understand it, and her uncle took great care that she should not learn. But the deed was the smaller half of what was done to her. The larger half, the truly clever half, the half that made all the rest safe, was the story. For Vincent Ashby understood that a deed could be questioned, but that a reputation, once fixed, could not. And so, gently, regretfully, with every appearance of grief and of a family's reluctance to speak of such a thing, he let it be known about the county that his poor niece was a great deal more afflicted than the world had supposed. It was not merely that she did not speak. He gave them to understand. It was that she could not. And worse, that there was a corresponding want behind the silence. That the fever of her childhood had touched the mind as well as the tongue. That she was, in the kindest possible word, simple. A sweet harmless creature with no more capacity for her own affairs than a child, who must be sheltered and provided for and on no account troubled with questions she could not answer, or business she could not comprehend. He said it with tears in his eyes. He said it as a sorrow nobly borne. And the county, which had decided years ago that there was probably not much behind that silent face, found the story entirely easy to believe, and was rather touched by the good uncle who had taken up so sad a charge, and stopped from that day expecting anything of Marian Ashby at all, which was precisely what her uncle had paid for. It is the cruelest thing in this whole story, I think, and I want you to sit with it a moment before we go on, because everything that follows turns on it. They did not merely steal her house. They stole the very possibility of her being believed. A woman robbed of her fortune may cry out and be heard. But they had arranged the world so that if Marian Ashby cried out, the cry itself would be taken as proof of the very affliction they had invented. The poor simple creature grown agitated and fanciful, and the kind uncle would shake his head sadly and lead her gently away. They had built her a prison whose walls were other people's pity, and pity, as Marian was to learn, is a great deal harder to break out of than hatred. And so within 2 years the cherished heiress of Thornleigh found that she had become, by slow degrees and without any single moment she could point to, a dependent in her own former home, then a poor relation, and at last very nearly a servant. The good servants who had known her from a child were turned off one by one and replaced with her uncle's people. The music room her father had loved was given over to Cecil, and Marian was given to understand, kindly, that since she was so fond of her music and so good with it, and since it would be a pity for so harmless a talent to go to waste, she should make herself useful by teaching the daughters of the neighboring families, the Mrs. This and the Mrs. That, their scales and their simple airs, for which service the families paid her uncle a small genteel fee, and Marian herself received her bed and her board and the privilege of being grateful. The silent afflicted niece who gave music lessons, that was what she became. And the county thought it a charming arrangement, and admired the uncle for it, and never once wondered why a simple creature who could not manage her own affairs could be trusted to teach. She bore it. She bore it because there seemed nothing else to do, and because grief had hollowed her out, and because some part of her, the part that had been a happy, loved child, could not quite believe that the world she had been promised was safe had turned on her so completely. She bore it with a straight back and a still face, and a great growing silence inside her, deeper even than the silence the world had always seen, where a life had once been. And in the long cold evenings, when the lessons were done and the great house had gone quiet, she went up the back stairs to the one place that was still her own. A small disused room high under the eaves where her mother's old traveling clavichord still stood, the small ivory-keyed instrument in its worn rosewood case that gave only a whisper of tone, too soft to carry beyond the door. And there, by stolen candle ends and the thin gray light of early mornings, she composed. For that was the thing they had not been able to take. In those first 2 years. Not yet. Music was the breath of her, the one place she was still entirely herself, and a keyboard under her hands was the nearest thing she had to her father's voice, and her own true voice besides, the only one that had never failed or locked or shamed her. And so she went on making music, quietly, for no one the way a person in prison might go on saying her prayers. Songs and short sonatas and airs, the things her father had taught her to make, and she signed each one as she always had. Not on the page but in the music, the 4 secret notes of her name woven into an inner part. Not because anyone would ever hear it for what it was, but because it was the truth, and the truth was the one thing left that was hers to tell. She did not know those 2 long years that she had a witness. The witness was Cecil Ashby, who was idle and curious and a light sleeper, and who came one evening, soft-footed and bored, up the back stairs to see what his silent cousin did with herself, and stood in the doorway of the attic room unseen, and listened. And whatever else Cecil was, he was not without a certain low cunning, and he had been raised by his father to know the exact price of things, and he saw at once, with a cold leap of understanding, that the music his afflicted cousin made in secret was not the pretty noodling of an accomplished young lady, but the real thing, the rare and saleable thing, work that fashionable people in London with more money than judgment would pay handsomely to publish and praise, and be seen to admire. And he saw, in the same cold moment, exactly how he would use it. For Cecil had been trying for a year to make something of himself, to acquire some accomplishment that would lift him above the common run of idle young men and bring him the notice of the great world and perhaps a rich wife. And music was the very thing in fashion that season, and here. Made to his hand by a creature who could not say a word against him, was a fountain of it. If you have ever made a thing with your whole heart, quietly, for love and for no reward, and had it taken from your hands by someone who could not have made it, and did not understand it, but knew precisely what it would fetch, then you already know the particular cold that was about to settle over Marian Ashby, deeper than the loss of the house, deeper even than the loss of her name. And if you have ever wished to see such a theft undone, and the true maker known at last before all the people who praised the thief, then stay with me, and stay with Marian, because what her cousin did next was the cruelest thing that had yet been done to her and the seed, though neither of them could know it, of his own undoing. It began as such things do, with a small experiment. Cecil took one of her songs, a setting of an old air that she had left finished on the desk, and he copied it out in his own fair hand, exactly as it stood, and at the top of the page, where the maker's name went, he wrote his own, and he carried it down to the music room, and learned to play it, after a fashion by dint of much labor and his cousin's unwitting example. For he could not truly read the music, but he could ape it once he had heard it through. And then he played it for company. He played it for his father's new friends one evening after dinner, with a becoming diffidence as a little thing of his own that he hardly dared to show, and the company was astonished, and said so, and the word went round as Cecil had hoped it would, that young Mr. Ashby of Thornleigh was not merely a handsome idle young man but a genuine composer, a discovery, a wonder. The song was, of course, Marian's. And the praise tasted so sweet, and was so easily had, that within a month Cecil had taken 3 more, and within the year he had a folio of them, all in his fair copying hand, and all under his own name. And his father had carried a selection to a London publisher, who heard a market in them and brought them out in a handsome bound edition. Songs and Airs, composed by Cecil Ashby, Esq. of Thornleigh, with the young man's name engraved in fine letters on the title page and a flattering dedication to a great patron of music. And they sold, and they were sung in fashionable drawing rooms across the kingdom, and Cecil Ashby became, that season, a name. Marian found it out by accident, in the worst possible way, standing at the back of her own father's music room with a pile of lesson books in her arms while a roomful of the family's grand new acquaintance pressed Cecil to play his celebrated air. She knew the song at the first chord, the way a mother knows her child across a crowded street. She had written it in the cold one February night when she could not sleep for grief, and it held the whole of that night in it, and she heard her cousin play it badly, getting the inner voices wrong and the time uneven and stumbling over the very passage she had labored longest to make true, and she heard the company sigh and praise and call it exquisite, and she heard Cecil accept the praise of it as his own, heard him speak with charming modesty of the difficulty he had had with the middle section, the very section he had just butchered, the very section into which, had he the ears to hear it, she had woven the 4 notes of her name, and she felt the floor of the world drop away beneath her a second time, She did not drop the books. She had learned, by then, not to drop things, not to cry out, not to give the people who had ruined her the satisfaction of seeing the wound, and besides, she could not have cried out if she had wished to, for her tongue had locked tight as a fist the moment the first strange face turned her way. She set down the lesson books on the side table with steady hands and went out of the room and up the back stairs to the attic, and sat down at her mother's whispering clavichord in the failing light, and understood that they had found a way to wear her very soul like a borrowed coat, and that there was nothing whatever she could do about it. There was a particular cruelty in the months that followed, a cruelty so refined that Cecil himself, perhaps, did not fully feel it, though he did nothing to spare her a moment of it. For the fame of the new composer brought the county and then the wider world to Thornleigh in a steady stream, all of them wanting to hear Mr. Cecil Ashby play, and Cecil, who could not in truth play his own celebrated music well enough to satisfy a discerning ear, hit upon a solution at once convenient and exquisitely cruel. He would have his silent cousin play it for him. It was given out as a charming kindness, a touching arrangement. Poor afflicted Marian was so devoted to her cousin's genius, and found such simple pleasure in the music, and played, for a poor creature, really rather creditably, and so dear Cecil, in his goodness, indulged her by letting her sit at the instrument and pick out his compositions while he turned the pages and received the company. And was it not affecting? The great-souled young man and his harmless silent cousin, and how good he was to her. And so Marian sat, evening after evening, at the keyboard in her father's music room, and played her own songs, flawlessly, the way they were meant to be played, the way only their maker could play them, while the company praised the man standing at her shoulder, and looked at her, when they looked at her at all, with the kindly vacant pity one gives to a well-trained animal that has done its trick. She learned, in those months, to play her own stolen soul to a room full of strangers with a smooth nothing on her face, and to bear the praise that flowed past her to the man at her side as a thing that no longer concerned her. There was one in particular, a Mrs. Penhallow, a loud, confident, fashionable woman with a great deal of money and not one grain of true feeling for music, who came often and admired loudly and liked above all things to be heard admiring, and Mrs. Penhallow would stand over the instrument while Marian played and would tell the company, with the air of a woman conferring a great favor upon the music by noticing it, exactly why Mr. Ashby's compositions were fine, getting every reason wrong, praising the very passages that were weakest in Cecil's butchering and passing over the places where, beneath her own hands, Marian knew she had caught something true, and Marian would play on, invisible, and listen to her own 3 nights' labor explained to her by a woman who could not have told a fugue from a country dance, and would think, with a calm that frightened her, that she had become a ghost haunting the music room of her own life, present at every conversation and party to none. Once, only once, Mrs. Penhallow, in a gush of condescension, patted Marian's shoulder as she played and said, loudly to the room, how wonderful it was that the poor afflicted thing could be made so happy and so useful. Just as if she understood it, and Marian's hands did not falter on the keys, but something behind her still face went very cold and very quiet, and she understood that to all of them she was less real than the music she made, which at least they credited to someone, and she finished the air, and rose and curtsied to the company as she had been taught, and carried herself out of the room with a straight back, and went up to the cold attic and sat in the dark a long time, and then she went on, because going on was the only thing left that she knew how to do. The worst of those public evenings, the one that lived in her afterward as the very bottom of that long second year, was the night of the great autumn assembly at the county town, to which the whole neighborhood went, and to which Marian was taken, not as a guest, but as a kind of ornament to her cousin's growing fame. For Cecil's celebrity was at its first full flush that season, and it suited Vincent to show the world the family entire, the gifted son and the good uncle and even the poor afflicted niece. Altogether, a portrait of benevolence, and so Marian was put into a made-over gown of her own better days, a gown that had been her mother's, and carried to the assembly rooms in the county town, and sat down on a hard chair against the wall among the chaperones and the spinsters and the other people no one meant to dance with. The rooms were bright with candles and loud with music, a hired band scraping out the country dances, and the whole county turning and laughing and showing itself off. And in the midst of it Cecil shone, handsome and sought after, with the published songs to his name and an heiress on his arm, and he moved through the rooms like a young prince and was made much of at every turn. And Marian sat against the wall in her mother's altered gown, and watched the music she could have written for them played badly by a hired band, and watched her own cousin praised to the skies by people who had never troubled to learn whether she herself could so much as hum, and was, for the whole of that long bright evening, entirely and pointedly alone. No one asked her to dance. Of course, one did not ask the poor afflicted thing to dance. But it was worse than being passed over, for now and then some kind soul, prompted by Cecil's much advertised goodness to his cousin, would come and sit beside her for a charitable minute and speak to her very slowly and very loudly, as one speaks to the deaf or the very young, about nothing at all, and pat her hand, and go away again glowing with their own benevolence, having never once waited for or expected an answer. And Marian would sit through it with her hands folded and her face composed and her whole soul on fire with a fury she could not speak, because to speak was the one thing the world had decided she could not do. There was a moment, late in the evening, that she carried with her for years. The band struck up a slow air, and she knew it at the first bar, for it was hers. One of her own songs got up as a dance tune, and a young couple near her chair began to move to it, and the girl said to her partner, breathless and admiring, "How exquisite Mr. Ashby's music was, and how wonderful it must be to have such a gift." And Marian sat 3 feet away, the author of the very notes they were dancing to, and could not say a word, and watched her own heart's work carry strangers laughing across a floor she was not thought fit to stand upon. And she understood, with a clarity that was almost peace, that she had been buried so deep and so cleverly that she might stand in the middle of a crowded room, the most gifted person in it, surrounded by the proof of her own genius, and be more alone than any soul in the kingdom. She did not weep at the assembly. She had long since stopped weeping where anyone could see. She waited out the evening, and was handed into the carriage at the end of it with the same vacant kindness one shows an invalid, and was carried home through the cold to Thornleigh, and she went up to her attic, and lit her candle, and sat down at her mother's whispering clavichord, and played, very softly, the slow air they had danced to, the way it was meant to be played, the way only she could play it, with her name woven into its inner voice where the whole laughing county could not reach. And that she thought was the only assembly she would ever truly be asked to, the one she held alone in the dark, where the music was honest and the name was hers. For what, after all, could she do? She was a penniless dependent with no protector and no proof, and, worst of all, no voice the world would credit, her word, which she could scarcely get out in any case, against the word of the respectable uncle and the celebrated cousin, and the whole fixed reputation of her own affliction. If she cried theft, she would be called mad, or fanciful, or worse, the poor simple creature grown agitated and deluded, fancying herself the author of her clever cousin's work. And would not that just prove how sadly her wits had gone? Her uncle made that very clear to her. The one time Marian, white and shaking and forcing the words out one by one through her locked throat, dared to try to speak of it, made it clear with a soft, sorrowful smile and a colder eye that no one would believe her, that she had not a penny nor a friend nor a voice to her name, that the small provision he allowed her was entirely at his discretion and could vanish at a word, and that an afflicted dependent who grew fanciful and made wild accusations and could not be managed at home might find herself placed somewhere quieter, somewhere more suitable to her condition, somewhere she could be properly cared for and need trouble the family no more. And he let the soft words hang in the air between them until she understood exactly what threat lived inside them, the asylum and the locked door, and the loss of even this, and she stopped trying to speak. And then her uncle, satisfied, said the thing that bound her to the wheel. He said that of course she might go on with her music, that it would be a pity to waste so useful a little talent, and that if she were a sensible, grateful girl and gave no trouble, and went on quietly providing the work and playing it so prettily for her cousin, then she should keep her bed and her board and her small provision, and they need none of them ever be unpleasant about it again. It was, Marian understood, a bargain offered to a prisoner. Make for us. Sign nothing. Say nothing, and you may stay out of the madhouse. And she had no choice that she could see, and so she took it. And that was how the truest musician in the county became a forger of her own work, made to manufacture in secret the very music that was sold and sung in the light under another man's name. If you've made it this far into Marian's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. For it is one thing to be robbed of a house and a fortune, which are things outside the self, and quite another to be robbed of your own voice and your own name and made to play the very music they stole from you for the praise of strangers. And Marian Ashby was about to learn that the very completeness of her silencing, the very thing that made her uncle safe, was the one flaw in the whole design, and that a name woven into the music itself is not a name destroyed, but only a name waiting, and that the one man in England with the ears to hear it was, that very season, on his way to her door. The 3 years that followed were the strangest and emptiest of Marian's life, and she lived them in two halves that never touched. By day, and on the bright evenings of company, she was the silent afflicted dependent of Thornleigh, the poor harmless creature who taught the neighbors' daughters their scales and played her cousin's celebrated music so prettily and so usefully, and was so touchingly devoted to his genius, and her cousin's celebrity grew, for the publisher brought out a second volume and then a third. All of them hers, and Cecil Ashby was sought after and flattered and half engaged, it was whispered, to an heiress who admired his soul, and Vincent Ashby spent the music's money as freely as he spent everything and was become a person of consequence in the county at last, which was the whole of what he had ever wanted. And by night Marian went up to the cold attic and made the music that paid for all of it, and signed it as she always had, the 4 secret notes of her name woven into the inner voice where no thief who could not read music would ever find them, and then watched her cousin carry each new piece away to be copied out in his fair hand and printed under his name and sung across the kingdom. That signature was the one small war Marian was still fighting, and she fought it the only way left to her, which was in secret, and with patience, and with a quiet stubborn faith she could not have justified. She knew that Cecil could not read the inner voices of the music well enough to find the figure. She knew that even had he found it he could never have understood what it was, the old note-name cipher being a piece of her father's particular learning that the fashionable world had wholly forgotten. And so she went on weaving her name into every piece. Certain and hidden, a name sung into the very fabric of the music where it could not be scraped away without unmaking the thing itself, and over it she laid the ordinary surface of the song for them to praise and steal, so that every work that left her hands carried her name in it, down in the dark beneath the melody, where it would wait. She did not know why she did it. She told herself it was only stubbornness, only the need to have told the truth somewhere even if no one ever read it. She did not let herself hope, because hope in her situation was a thing too sharp to hold. But she did it, every time all those long 3 years, laid her true name down in the music beneath the lie, and let it go, and her father's words came back to her sometimes as she did it, that a true voice was a kind of honesty no one could take, and she would think, bitterly, that he had been wrong, that they had taken it after all, and then she would weave her name in again beneath the melody, just the same, as if some part of her did not quite believe him to be wrong. And there was one more thing she did, in the last winter of those 3 years, that she could not have explained even to herself. Her father had pressed her mother's worn traveling clavichord upon her in the last week of his life, the small ivory-keyed instrument in its rosewood case, too soft of tone to be of any use in company and therefore left to her when everything else was taken, and he had told her, in the wandering way of the very ill, to keep it always, and to mind the soundboard that it was loose, that she must never have it mended by a stranger but only look to it herself when she had need, that a thing well made would give up what it held in its own good time, and that a true voice could not be silenced, and a name sung into the music itself could not be scraped from the page. She had taken it for the wandering of a dying man, and wept, and kept the clavichord because it was her mother's, and because it was the one instrument they had let her keep, and on the cold nights she played it under her breath, the felted strings giving only a whisper, and thought of him, and never once, in 3 years, did she think to wonder why a man with a forged deed already closing over his daughter's whole life should spend his failing breath on the loose soundboard of an old clavichord. She would learn. But not yet. The afternoon the cold Earl of Wickham came to Thornleigh was a bright cold one in the first week of April, and Marian had no warning of it, and no reason to think it different from any other afternoon of company, except that the visitor was a greater man than usually came, and that her cousin had been in a fever of nerves about it for a week. For the Earl of Wickham was the very patron to whom the published songs had been dedicated, the great private connoisseur of music whose notice could make a young composer's fortune entire, and he had at last, after much courting, signified that he would come into the county and call at Thornleigh and hear Mr. Cecil Ashby's celebrated music from the composer's own hands. And Cecil, who knew perfectly well that he could not play his own celebrated music from his own hands well enough to satisfy a footman, let alone the most exacting ear in England, had spent the week alternately bullying and cajoling his silent cousin into a state of readiness, drilling her on which pieces she was to play and reminding her, with a viciousness that showed how frightened he was, of exactly what would become of her if she gave him away by so much as a look. I must tell you something now about the Earl of Wickham, because the county had him entirely wrong, and the having of him wrong is the hinge of everything that follows. His name was Julian Hartley, and he was about 32, and he was, by the universal verdict of the county and indeed of the wider world, the coldest man in 3 shires. He was tall and grave and exact. He did not flatter. He did not make small talk. He had a way of looking at a thing or a person with a cool, steady attention that fashionable people found unnerving, because they were not used to being truly looked at, and he had never in his life pretended to admire something he did not admire, which in the world he moved in was thought a kind of rudeness amounting almost to vice. He had buried young, the one person who had ever wholly known him, an old music master of his boyhood who had taught him to listen, and since then he had given the whole of his guarded heart to a single honest pursuit, which was music truly made and truly heard. He could not abide a fashionable fraud, the spectacle of a room full of people praising a thing they did not understand, and a maker accepting praise he had not earned, was to him a kind of physical pain. And he had come to Thornleigh, in truth, not because he expected to admire Cecil Ashby, but because the songs themselves, the actual music on the actual page, had struck him to the heart in a way almost nothing had struck him in years. There was a truth in them, a particular grave tenderness, that he had not met since his old master died, and he wanted, with the whole of his serious soul, to meet the mind that had made it. The county thought him heartless. He was nothing of the kind. He was only exact, and he was about to be the most dangerous thing in the world to Vincent and Cecil Ashby, which was a man who actually listened. He came in the early afternoon, in a fine plain traveling carriage, and Cecil met him on the steps in a glory of nerves and fashionable welcome, and Vincent hovered, smooth and proprietary. And the great drawing-room had been opened and the instrument made ready and the best of the county assembled to witness the honor, and in the midst of it all, at the keyboard where she had been placed, sat the silent afflicted cousin in her plain grey gown, with her eyes down and her hands folded in her lap, so much a part of the furniture that the Earl, coming in, did not at first see her at all. He saw the room, and the company, and the smooth uncle, and the handsome anxious young man who was, he understood, to be the genius of the afternoon, and he was civil, and grave, and a little weary, and he sat where he was placed, and waited to be played to, and prepared himself, with the patience of long disappointment. to find that the music he had loved had come out of a fool. And then Marian began to play. She played, because she had been told to, the first of Cecil's celebrated airs. The very one the Earl had loved best on the page, and from the first bar the Earl of Wickham sat forward in his chair. For he had heard the song badly played and well sung in a dozen fashionable rooms, and had thought he knew it, and he had never heard it like this, never heard the inner voices brought up true, and the time held perfect, and the grave tender heart of the thing laid bare as though the very person who had felt it were feeling it again under her hands, and he understood, with the swift certainty of a man who has spent his life listening, that he was hearing the music played, for the first time, by someone who knew it from the inside, who had not learned it but made it. He looked at the young man standing by the instrument, smiling and turning the pages and accepting the room's admiring glances, and he looked at the silent woman at the keyboard, with her bent head and her flying sure hands and her still wet face, for she was weeping, silently as she played, the slow helpless tears of a person doing the one thing that is wholly herself. And something in the Earl of Wickham, some cold exact instrument that never lied to him, swung hard over and told him that the arrangement of the room was a lie. He said nothing. He was a careful man. But he began, from that moment, to listen with his whole attention, not to the music only, but to everything, and a man of his sort, once he begins truly to listen, hears a very great deal. What he heard, over the next hour, undid them. For when the air was finished and the company applauded, the Earl turned to Cecil courteously and began to talk to him about the music, not idle praise, but the real talk of one musician to another, the talk Cecil had been dreading all week. He asked him about the curious modulation in the middle section, the bold stroke he admired most, and Cecil, who did not know what a modulation was, smiled and said that he was glad his lordship liked it, and that it had come to him quite naturally. The Earl asked him whether he had meant the answering phrase in the second part to invert the first, as it seemed to do, or whether the resemblance was an accident, and Cecil, sweating now, said that he hardly knew, that he composed by feeling and not by rule. The Earl, his cool gray eyes very steady, asked him to play a particular passage again, the difficult one, alone, slowly, that they might look at it together, and Cecil could not. He fumbled at the keys, and struck wrong notes, and laughed it off as nerves before so great a judge, and offered instead to have his cousin play it since the poor creature had it so pat, and the Earl said, gravely, that he would very much like to hear the cousin play it, and Marian played it, perfectly. And the Earl watched her hands and her face and not Cecil's at all. And then the Earl of Wickham did a thing that no one in that room understood the meaning of, and that Marian would remember to the last day of her life. He turned from Cecil entirely, and crossed the room to the instrument, and bowed to the silent woman at the keyboard. A true grave bow, the bow one gives an equal. And he said to her, quietly, not loudly, not for the room, but to her, as if her affliction did not exist, and her opinion were the only one in the house worth having, that he had never in his life heard that passage played so, and that whoever had made it had understood something about the answering of grief, with grief that he had thought no living composer understood, and he should be honored to know what she thought of it. He asked her opinion. No one had asked Marian Ashby her opinion of anything in 3 years, and the room tittered, gently, at the great man's eccentric kindness to the poor simple thing, and Cecil moved quickly to say that his cousin could not answer, that she did not speak, that she understood very little, really, poor Marian. And the Earl of Wickham looked at Cecil for a long cool moment, and then looked back at Marian, who had raised her grey eyes to his for the first time, and who was looking at him with an expression he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve, the look of a person buried alive who has heard, far off, the first sound of someone digging. And the Earl did not believe one word that he had been told about her, and she saw that he did not, and that was the beginning. He went away that afternoon civil and grave and giving nothing away, and Cecil and Vincent congratulated themselves that they had carried it off, that the great man had been impressed, that the dangerous questions had been weathered, and they were fools, and did not know it. For the Earl of Wickham had gone away with his whole exact mind awake and certain that the celebrated young composer of Thornleigh had not written a note of the music that bore his name, and that the person who had was the silent woman they kept at the keyboard like a piece of mechanism, and a man of his sort, having understood such a thing, was not capable of letting it lie. He did not yet know her name, or her story, or how the thing had been done. But he had heard the truth with his own ears, and he meant, with the quiet, implacable patience that was the real shape of his coldness, to find the rest of it out. If you are still with Marian, and I hope with all my heart that you are, then take her hand now, because this is the place where the long dark middle of her story turns, and it turns as such things do. Not with a thunderclap, but with a man crossing a room to ask a silenced woman what she thought. The Earl began to come to Thornleigh. He came on the pretext, which deceived nobody and needed to deceive nobody, of wishing to hear more of Mr. B. Ashby's music, and of taking a patron's kind interest in a rising young composer, and Vincent and Cecil, delighted and greedy and blind, threw the house open to him and pressed every honor upon him, and never once perceived that the great man's kind interest was fixed not upon Cecil at all, but upon the silent woman at the keyboard. For the Earl came to listen, and each time he came he found a way, courteous and unhurried, to speak with Marian, and he learned, slowly, painstakingly, with a patience that was itself a kind of tenderness, how to speak with her so that she could answer. He discovered, the first time he managed to be alone with her for a moment, in the music room while Cecil was called away, that she could speak to him at all, haltingly with effort, the words locking and fleeing, but speak, for she had begun, against every habit of 3 years' silence, to trust him, and trust loosened her tongue as nothing else could. And when even speech failed her, when the stammer closed her throat entirely, and she stood crimson and mute and despairing, the Earl, who was the most patient man she had ever met, simply waited, or, better, he learned to ask her things she could answer at the keyboard, to say, "Show me," and she would turn to the instrument and tell him in music what she could not tell him in words, and he understood her perfectly, for it was the only language in the world he trusted more than speech. It was the strangest courtship, though neither of them called it that, and neither of them yet knew it was one. He never pitied her. That was the thing that broke her open, by slow degrees over that long spring, that this grave exacting man, alone of everyone she had met in 3 years, did not treat her as afflicted, did not raise his voice or simplify his words or look at her with that kindly vacancy that was worse than cruelty. He spoke to her as to the most intelligent person in any room, because he had decided, on the evidence of his own ears, that she was, and he waited out her silences as a thing of no consequence, the way one waits out a pause in conversation, and went on attending to what she had to say as though it were the only thing worth attending to. And under that steady regard Marian Ashby began, for the first time since her father died, to come back to life. She did not know she was doing it. She only knew that the days the Earl was expected were different from other days, and that she found herself, in the cold attic at night, composing things she had not the heart to compose before, and weaving her name into them with something that was almost again like hope. And while the Earl courted her in the music room, his man Mr. Good was quietly at work, and the work went forward in 3 directions at once, each of them a thread that would in time be drawn into the one cord that hanged the thieves. The first thread was the publisher. Mr. Good went up to London on a plain errand, presenting himself as the agent of a noble collector who wished to commission new work from the celebrated Mr. Cecil Ashby, and was received civilly in the publisher's back room, and asked, in the course of business, a great many idle-seeming questions, and he came away having learned, without the publisher ever suspecting he had told it, that Mr. Ashby's manuscripts always arrived perfectly fair, copied in a single careful hand, never blotted, never corrected, never with the working over that a true composer's drafts always show, as though they had been copied from something rather than composed, and that on the one occasion the publisher had ventured a small technical query about a doubtful bar, the answer had come back, after a curious delay, in terms so wide of the point that the publisher, a knowing man, had privately wondered ever since whether the gentleman quite understood his own music. It was not proof, but it was a crack, and Mr. Good noted it, and went on. The second thread was the solicitor, for the Earl had been struck from the first by the strange business of the old family lawyer turned from the door, and had set Mr. Good to find him. It took some weeks, for the man had given up his practice and removed himself into the next county in something like disgust. But find him Mr. Good did, an upright grey old gentleman named Wakely, who, the moment he understood that someone had come at last to ask the questions he had waited 3 years to be asked, grew very still, and then very angry, in the cold contained way of an honest man who has been made a party to a wrong against his will. He told Mr. Good that he had drawn Mr. Edmund Ashby's true will himself, years before, in the days of that gentleman's full health, and that it had left everything, plainly and absolutely to the daughter, with not one word of any guardian or any incapacity. That he had been the late master's man of business for 30 years, and had never in his life heard him express the smallest doubt of his daughter's wits, the notion being, said Mr. Wakely with contempt, a manifest and contemptible invention, that he had presented himself at Thornleigh within a week of the death to prove that will, and had been refused admittance by Vincent Ashby's new servants, and warned in so many words that any interference would be met with a charge of meddling and worse, and that the deed of guardianship afterward produced was, in his professional judgment, either a forgery outright or got by fraud from a dying and medicated man, and that he had said as much, privately, to anyone who would listen, which in a county that had decided to believe the comfortable story had been nobody at all. He gave Mr. Good the date and the witnesses of the true will, and undertook to come and swear to all of it whenever and wherever he should be called. And Mr. Good rode back to the Earl with the second thread in his hand, and the cord was taking shape. The third thread was the servants. One by one Mr. Good sought out the old Thornleigh people who had been turned off when Vincent came, the housekeeper and the gardener and the rest, scattered now into other service or fallen on hard times, and from them he gathered the texture of the truth, how the young mistress had been clever and merry and whole before her father died and her uncle came, how the talk of her being simple had begun only after, put about by Vincent's own people, how no one below stairs had ever believed a word of it, and at the last he came to the one that mattered most, old Mr. Pott, the dead master's body servant, a faithful grey old man living poor in a cottage on the county's charity, who, when he understood who had sent Mr. Good and why, wept like a child, and said that he had been waiting 3 years to die with the thing he knew still untold, and was glad now that he need not, for he had a thing to tell, he said, that would undo the whole of it, if only the right person ever came to ask, and the right person had come at last. But what old Mr. Pott knew, the Earl judged it wiser not to act upon yet, but to hold in reserve against the proper hour, and so the 3 threads lay coiled and ready in Mr. Good's careful keeping, and the Earl said nothing of any of it to Marian, against the day he could lay the whole of it before her not as a hope but as a certainty, with her freedom already in his hand. And the Earl, for his part, fell in love. He did it the way he did everything, exactly and without fuss, and entirely. He fell in love first with the music, and then with the mind he could see at work behind it, and then, slowly, with the whole of the brave, silent, ruined woman who owned both. And he was a great deal further gone than he knew before he ever admitted to himself what was happening. He told himself, for a while, that it was only justice he wanted, the righting of a wrong, the exposure of a fraud that offended his soul, and it was that. But it was not only that, for he had found in the silent music mistress of Thornleigh the one thing his exact and lonely life had never offered him. Another person who loved the truth of a thing above its fashion, who heard what he heard, who could not lie in music any more than he could bear to hear a lie in it, and he, the coldest man in 3 shires, who had given up on ever being known, found himself known, wholly and without a word, by a woman who could scarcely speak, and it undid him entirely, and he was glad. But he was not a rash man, and he understood, better than Marian did, the exact nature of the trap she was in. He saw that to expose the theft of the songs alone would not be enough, that Cecil and Vincent would simply deny it, and produce the published volumes in Cecil's name, and point to the poor afflicted cousin who fancied herself a composer, and the world, which already believed her simple, would believe them. That to free her he must break not the smaller lie but the larger one, the lie of her affliction and incapacity, the forged deed and the stolen fortune that lay beneath everything. And that to do that he would need proof, hard proof, the kind that would stand up before the law and the county both, and not merely the certainty of his own ears. And so, while he courted her in the music room with one half of his mind, he set the other half, and his whole considerable fortune, and his steady weathered man of business Mr. Good to the patient work of finding it. He had Mr. Good trace the history of the published songs and the dealings with the London publisher. He had him hunt for the old solicitor who had drawn Edmund Ashby's affairs and been so strangely turned from the door. He had him search out the turned-off servants who had known the house in the old master's day. And quietly, without telling Marian, against the day he could tell her with proof in his hand, he built his case. The midpoint of any such story is the place where the thing the heroine has endured is revealed to have been one deliberate design and not a run of bad fortune, and where the hero is revealed to be not what the world has called him, and so it was for Marian. For one grey afternoon in May, the Earl, having got at last from Mr. Good the first hard piece of the truth, did a thing he had never done. He asked Marian gravely, in the empty music room, to tell him the whole of what had happened to her, from her father's illness onward, and he promised her, on his honor, that he believed her already, that nothing she could say would seem to him the fancy of an afflicted mind, that he had come to Thornleigh believing one thing and now believed another and meant to act on it. And Marian, who had not told the whole truth to a living soul in 3 years, who had been taught by every day of those years that to tell it was to be called mad, looked into the steady grey eyes of the one person who had never once doubted her, and began haltingly with terrible effort, the words locking and breaking and coming on again, to tell him the marriage in the sick room, the turned-away solicitor, the deed she had never seen drawn, the story of her affliction spread like a net, the music taken from her hands. And when her voice failed her at last, as it always did, she did the thing she had learned to do with him, and turned to the instrument and played him the rest. She played him 3 years of it, the grief and the silence and the cold attic and the slow theft of her soul, and the Earl of Wickham sat and listened to the whole of her ruin told in music. And when it was done he found that the coldest man in 3 shires was not ashamed to be weeping, and he took her 2 hands from the keys and held them, and told her that it was over, that the silence was over, that he had heard her and he believed her, and he was going to give her back her name if it was the last thing he did in the world. And Marian Ashby, for the first time in 3 years, in the empty music room of her stolen house, with her hands in the hands of a man who had truly listened, put her head down and wept without hiding it, and was, for that one moment, not afraid. But the proof was not yet complete, and the danger was very real, and it was about to grow worse, for Cecil and Vincent, though blind to the Earl's true purpose, were not entirely without uneasiness, and the engagement Cecil hoped for with his admiring heiress was pressing him to consolidate his fame, and Vincent had debts that the music's money no longer wholly covered. And so they resolved upon a stroke that would, they thought, fix Cecil's reputation beyond all question and bring the great patron's full support. A grand public concert, an exhibition of Mr. Cecil Ashby's genius, to be held at Thornleigh before the assembled county and the Earl of Wickham himself, at which Cecil would present a great new work, a full sonata, the crown of his achievement, dedicated to his lordship. The new work was of course to be Marian's. She was set to making it, the largest and finest thing they had yet demanded of her, against a fixed and brutal deadline on pain of the asylum if she failed or faltered, and Cecil was to take the credit for it before the whole world, with the Earl of Wickham sitting in the seat of honor. They thought it the masterstroke of their whole career. They had in fact arranged with their own hands the exact stage upon which they would be destroyed. The cruelest blow fell 3 days before the concert, and it fell, as the cruelest blows in Marian's life always had. In public, and through the music. There was a small private evening at Thornleigh, the last gathering before the great event, and Cecil, flushed with wine and his own coming triumph and a little frightened of it, took it into his head to be witty at his cousin's expense before the company, and he spoke, laughing, of how affecting it was that poor Marian was so devoted to his music that she fancied, sometimes, in her simple way, that she had had a hand in it herself. Was it not touching? The poor creature would sit at the instrument and grow quite agitated and try to say, in her broken way, that this phrase or that was hers. And of course one humored her, poor thing, for it gave her such pleasure to imagine herself a part of his work. The company laughed, kindly, indulgently, and looked at Marian with pity, and Vincent smiled his smooth, sorrowful smile. And Cecil, encouraged, turned to her where she sat at the keyboard and said, loudly, for the room, "Come, Marian, play us your favorite of my songs. There's a good girl. And never mind the fancies." And Marian sat with her hands on the keys and her face burning, and her throat locked tight as iron, knowing that if she opened her mouth nothing would come but the broken stammer that would prove his every word, that the trap was perfect, that to protest was to confirm her own madness before the whole room, and she felt the old black despair rise up in her, the certainty that the silence would never break, that they had her, that there was no way out of a prison whose walls were other people's pity. And then she looked up, and across the room, in the seat of honor, sat the Earl of Wickham, and he was not laughing. He was looking at her with his cool, steady eyes, and in them was a message meant for her alone. Plain as speech to the one person in the room who knew how to read silence. Not yet. Hold, I have heard you. Wait for me. And Marian Ashby, who had no weapon in the world but her 2 hands and her stubborn hidden truth, drew one slow breath, and did not try to speak, and did not weep, and did not break. She only turned to the instrument, and began to play. But she did not play her favorite of Cecil's songs. She played, instead, slowly, deliberately, looking not at the keys but at the Earl, the new sonata, the great unfinished work they had set her to make for Cecil's triumph, the crown of the whole theft, and she played, with particular care, bringing it up out of the inner voices where it had always lived and never once been heard, the 4-note figure of her signing motif, the cipher of her own name, A and E flat and B and the rest, woven into the heart of the music, again, and again, and again, so that any ear in the room with the learning to hear it could not have missed it. The company heard only a strange grave passage, very beautiful, and praised it idly. Cecil heard nothing at all. But the Earl of Wickham, who had spent 3 weeks learning the old note-name cipher from a book in his own library against this very hour, heard his beloved's name sung out plain in the music of the work her cousin meant to claim 3 days hence before all the world, and he understood that she had just told him, in the only voice she fully owned, that she was ready, and that she trusted him, and that whatever he meant to do, the time was now. And the cold Earl of Wickham smiled, very slightly, the smile of a man who has been handed the last piece of a thing he has been building for a long time, and inclined his head to her across the room, and began, quietly, to make ready. There remained one thing wanting, and Marian herself supplied it. That very night, though she did not at first know what she had found. For the encounter in the drawing-room had shaken something loose in her, a memory, her father's wandering voice in his last week, telling her to mind the soundboard of the old clavichord, that it was loose, that a thing well made would give up what it held in its own good time, and lying sleepless in the cold attic in the small hours. With the great concert 2 days off and her whole fate trembling, she found herself thinking of it, and rose, and lit her candle, and went to her mother's whispering clavichord in its worn rosewood case, and looked at it, truly looked at it, for the first time in 3 years, and she saw that the thin band of brass on the lid was loose at one corner, and that the soundboard beneath the felted strings did not sit quite true, as though it had once been lifted and set back, and her father's words came to her again. Mind the soundboard. Look to it yourself when you have need. And her hands began to shake. She took her father's worn ebony tuning fork from the case, the one thing of his she had left, and used its handle. Gently, gently, as he had told her, never forcing, to ease up the loose edge of the soundboard, and the old wood, well made and waiting, gave at last, and lifted on a hidden hinge no eye had been meant to find, and beneath it, in a shallow space built into the body of the instrument by a master's careful hands against this very night, lay papers, dry and safe and waiting, hidden there by a dying father under the colors of an old whisper-toned clavichord that no thief had ever thought worth the searching. There were 3 of them, and Marian read them by her single candle in the cold, with her heart going like a hammer. The first was a letter, in her father's own dear failing hand, written, it said, in secret, in his last illness, when he had come at last to understand what his brother meant to do and had been too weak and too closely watched to prevent it by any open means, and in it he told her everything. He told her that he knew Vincent had got him, in a confused and medicated hour, to set his hand to a paper Vincent called a deed of guardianship, and that he believed Vincent meant to use it to rob her, that he had not the strength left to fight it openly, nor any longer a solicitor he could reach, for Vincent had seen to that, but that he had done what a dying man could do in secret, with the help of the one servant still faithful to him, old Mr. Pott, and that what he had hidden with this letter would, if she could only keep it safe until she found a friend strong enough to use it, undo the whole of the wrong. He begged her forgiveness for not having seen the danger sooner. He told her to be brave, and to keep making her music, for it was the truest thing she had and they could never truly take it, and he told her, once more, the words she had thought were only the wandering of his fever, that a true voice could not be silenced, and a name sung into the music itself could not be scraped from the page, and Marian, reading them now, understood at last that they had not been wandering at all, but the plainest message a watched and dying man could leave, pointing her, if she had only known it, straight to the hidden soundboard and the truth beneath it. The second paper was the will, not the forged deed of guardianship that Vincent had used, but Mr. Edmund Ashby's true and proper last will, drawn and signed and witnessed in due form some years before his illness, in the days of his full health and sound mind, before ever Vincent came to Thornleigh, and it left, in plain unmistakable terms, the whole of the Thornleigh estate and the entire fortune and the famous collection, absolutely and without condition, to his beloved daughter Marian, with not one word about any incapacity or any guardian, for in the days of his health her father had never for one moment doubted his daughter's perfect competence to own and manage her own life. And the third paper was the one that proved the crime. It was a single ruled card, in her father's hand, on which he had written out plainly the key to the music cipher, the old note-name signature, setting down which notes spelled which letters and how Marian signed her name into the inner voice of all her work, attested and dated and signed by him as a true account of his daughter's private method of authorship, so that any person who doubted whose hand had truly made the celebrated Ashby songs need only take the card, and the published scores, and read out the hidden name for themselves. And no, Marian sat a long time in the cold, with the 3 papers in her lap and her father's love and foresight all around her in the dark, and wept, and then did not weep, but grew very still, and very clear, for she understood that the long silence was ending, and that she held in her 2 hands the means of her own deliverance, and that her father, dying, watched, helpless, robbed, had reached 3 years through the dark to put it there. And in the morning she did a thing that cost her more courage than anything she had ever done, more than enduring, more than silence. She carried the 3 papers, hidden in her gown, down through the house and out by the garden door, and gave them, with shaking hands and a few broken words, and then, when the words failed, a look that said the rest, to the Earl of Wickham, who had come early and was waiting for her in the cold spring garden as if he had known, and she put her whole life into his keeping, and trusted him with it, which was the bravest thing a woman who had been so betrayed could possibly do. And the Earl of Wickham took the papers, and read them standing there in the grey morning. And Marian watched the slow cold blaze of triumph and a fierce protective tenderness come up together in his hard face, and when he had read the last of them he looked up at her, and said very quietly that a mind such as hers, kept alive in the dark all this while, and a courage such as her father's, reaching out of death to save her, were the two bravest things he had ever known, and that she need not be afraid any longer, not of anything, not of anyone, ever again, and that he would see the whole of it set right before the very county that had pitied her, in 2 days' time in the open, where they had wronged her. And then he went away to make it ready, with Mr. Good and the recovered solicitor, and the old turned-off servants all summoned and waiting. And Marian went back into the house and taught a music lesson with steady hands, and waited for the concert that was to be her cousin's triumph and was, instead, to be his ruin. The day of the great concert came bright and cold, and Thornleigh was thrown open in a blaze of consequence, the long drawing-room filled with the best of the county and beyond, candles lit against the spring dusk though it was barely evening, the famous instrument made ready in the place of honor, and Cecil Ashby handsome and flushed and trembling with the nearness of his triumph, moving among the company in the certainty that this night would fix his fame forever, and beside him his father Vincent, smooth and proprietary and already, in his mind spending the patronage this night would surely bring, and in the seat of honor, grave and cool and giving nothing away, the Earl of Wickham, with his man Mr. Brett, Good somewhere quiet at the back, and certain other persons not yet come into the room. And at the keyboard, in her plain grey gown, with her hands folded and her eyes down, sat the silent afflicted cousin, the poor harmless creature who would play her cousin's masterpiece for him so prettily and so usefully one last time, or so every soul in that room believed, save two. The concert began, and Marian played, and the room was held, for she played as she always played, which was as no one else in England could, and even the company that had come to admire Cecil felt dimly that there was something in the playing tonight that went beyond the music. And then came the moment of the great new sonata, the crown of the evening, and Cecil rose, and made his graceful practiced speech, thanking the noble patron whose presence so honored them, and presenting with becoming modesty his new work, the finest thing he had yet been moved to compose, and dedicating it humbly to the Earl of Wickham, and the company applauded, and Cecil bowed, and turned, and signed to his cousin to begin. And Marian set her hands to the keys and played the great sonata through, the whole magnificent thing, her own 3 months' secret labor, bringing it up entire and true for the only time it would ever be played, and weaving through it, plain for the one ear that knew, the 4 notes of her name, and when the last chord had died the room rose to its feet in a storm of applause, the greatest of Cecil Ashby's career, and Cecil stood bathed in it, radiant, made. And the Earl of Wickham rose slowly from the seat of honor, and the room fell quiet to hear the great patron's praise, and the Earl of Wickham said, into the listening silence, that it was the most beautiful new work he had heard in 20 years, and that he wished, before the assembled company, to do its true author the honor she deserved. And then, in the ringing quiet, with every eye upon him, the Earl of Wickham took the matter into his own exacting hands, and dismantled, piece by piece, in the space of a quarter of an hour, the whole edifice of lies that had buried Marian Ashby for 3 years. He said that he had been struck, on first hearing the celebrated Ashby songs, by a particular and most learned device woven into the inner voices of them, an old note-name cipher, long forgotten by the fashionable world, by which the true composer had signed every work with the letters of a name, and he asked the company, courteously, whether Mr. Cecil Ashby, the celebrated author, would oblige them by reading out the name his own cipher spelled. And Cecil, white now, stammering himself, said that he did not know what his lordship meant, that he used no cipher, that he composed by feeling, and the Earl said, gravely, that he had thought as much, and held up, for the room to see, a single ruled card in the late Mr. Edmund Ashby's own attested hand, and read out from it the key to the cipher, and then sat down at the instrument himself and played, slowly, the 4 notes that recurred through every Ashby song and through the great sonata they had just heard, and spelled out, note by note, before the whole assembled county, the letters they made, not Cecil, not Ashby his, but the hidden name sung into the heart of all that stolen music, the name of its true and only maker, Marian. The room went very still, and the Earl, relentless and quiet and exact, did not stop there, for he called forward then into that stillness the persons who had been waiting. The old solicitor, Miss Wakely, who had drawn Edmund Ashby's affairs and been turned from the door, and who now produced and read out into the ringing silence the true and proper last will of Mr. Edmund Ashby, made in health and soundness years before any deed of guardianship, leaving the whole of Thornleigh and the whole of the fortune absolutely to his daughter Marian, with not one word of any incapacity, and old Mr. Pot, the one faithful servant, grey and trembling and proud, who told the company how his dying master had charged him to help hide the true will and the letter and the cipher key in the body of the old clavitured, against the day his watched and helpless daughter should find a friend strong enough to use them, and Mr. Good, the Earl's own man, who laid out, plain and damning, the history of the forged deed and the stolen songs and the moneys Vincent Ashby had drawn, and at the last the Earl read out, into a silence you could have heard a pin drop into, the dying father's own letter, in his own dear hand, telling his daughter the truth of what had been done and begging her to be brave and keep her music safe. And the whole county, which had pitied the poor simple creature at the keyboard, and admired the good uncle and lionized the gifted cousin, sat in its rows of gilt chairs and understood, all at once and beyond any possibility of doubt, that it had been comprehensively and contemptibly deceived, that the afflicted niece was the rightful mistress of the house in which they sat, and the truest composer of the age, and as sound of mind as any soul in the room, and that the genius they had worshipped was a thief who could not read the music he had sold, and the good uncle a forger who had stolen a helpless girl's whole life, and themselves the willing dupes of both. It was Marian's vindication, and it was complete, and it was witnessed by the very room that had wronged her. And the most remarkable thing about it, the thing the county spoke of for years after, was that Marian Ashby never said a word. She did not need to. She sat at the keyboard while the truth was read out all around her, very straight and very still, with the tears running silent and unhidden down her face, and when the Earl had finished, and the room sat stunned and shamed, and Vincent Ashby had gone the color of ash and Cecil had sunk into a chair with his face in his hands, the Earl of Wickham crossed the room once more, as he had on that first afternoon, and bowed to her, the deep grave bow one gives a great lady in her own house. And he gave her his hand, and raised her up, and turned her to face the room that had buried her, and Marian Ashby stood before the assembled county in her plain grey gown, the rightful mistress of Thornleigh, restored, whole and known at last, and did not crow, and did not rail, and did not weep any longer. She only looked at them, steadily, one by one, the people who had pitied her and never asked her a single question, and let them see, in her clear unafraid grey eyes, exactly who had been living behind the silence all along, and it was a more terrible reproach than any words could have been, and they knew it, and they could not meet her eyes. The law took its slow course with Vincent and Cecil Ashby in the weeks that followed, and I will not weary you with the whole of it. Enough to say that the forged deed was overthrown, and the true will established, that the estate and the fortune were restored to Marian entire, that Vincent was pursued for the moneys he had stolen and ruined past recovery and left the county under a cloud he never came out from under, and that Cecil, exposed as a thief who could not so much as read the music he had claimed, became overnight the most ridiculous man in England, his fashionable engagement broken, his celebrity turned to scorn, his name a byword in the very drawing-rooms that had lionized him, and went abroad and was not much heard of again. Mrs. Penhallow, who had patted the poor afflicted thing on the shoulder, was not seen at Thornleigh again, and took care to tell everyone that she had always thought there was something not quite right about young Mr. Ashby. The county, which is not cruel so much as lazy, was mortified, and made what amends mortified people make, which is to admire extravagantly the very person they have wronged, and Marian, restored to her own, found herself courted, and flattered, and called a genius by the same mouths that had called her simple, and bore it with a composure that gave away nothing of what she thought of them. But the published volumes were called in and reissued, every one under their true author's name, and that was a sweeter vindication to Marian than all the county's flattery, to hold in her hands at last the bound score with the title page that read, in fine plain letters, Songs and Airs, composed by Miss Marian Ashby, of Thornleigh, her own name in the open at last, where her cousins had been. And to know that wherever those songs were sung now, across the whole kingdom, they were sung as hers. She did not marry the Earl at once. I want you to know that, because it matters, and because she would want you to know it. The cold Earl of Wickham, who had fallen in love with her music before he ever heard her voice, and with the whole of her after, asked her, of course, asked her honestly and humbly, for so proud a man, in the long music room where he had first crossed a room to ask a silenced woman what she thought, and told her that he had loved her since he first truly heard her, and that he wanted nothing in the world so much as the right to stand beside her for the rest of his life, and never let the world be cruel to her again. But Marian, who had been owned by other people's wills for 3 long years, who had been a thing disposed of and spoken for and stolen, would not be taken up, even by love, even by him, until she had first stood on her own ground in her own name and known herself free. And she told him so, in her own halting, careful voice, which came easier to her every day now that there was someone who waited for it, that she must be Marian Ashby of Thornleigh, restored and whole and her own, before she could be anyone's wife, even his. And the Earl of Wickham, who loved the truth above all things, understood her completely, and honored her for it, and waited. And so she took a year, a whole turning year in her own house, making her music in the open, managing her own restored estate with the competence her father had taught her and the world had been told she lacked, being at last simply herself, the woman she had been promised she would grow up to be before the world turned cruel. And the Earl came courting, properly and openly now, through the seasons of that year, and there was no cold in it at all, whatever the county still believed of him, for the two of them, the grave composer and the exacting connoisseur, the two truth-loving creatures alone in a world of fashion, had found in each other the one thing each had never thought to have, which was to be wholly seen and wholly known by another, and to be after so long no longer alone. And when at the year's turning she said yes, she said it freely, in her own clear voice, from her own ground, as a gift and not a rescue. And that, she thought, looking at the steady gray eyes of the man who had brought her name up out of the music, was the only way a thing so precious ought ever to be given. They were married quietly in the little church at Thornleigh, in the early summer, with old Mr. Wakely the solicitor beaming in the front pew and old Mr. Pott, restored to his place and to his pride, weeping happily into a vast handkerchief, and the county, which had so lately worshipped a thief, looking on at the true heiress of Thornleigh and her cold Earl, and finding, to its own surprise, that the coldest man in 3 shires could smile after all, when he looked at his wife. And among the Earl's first quiet acts as her husband was one that made Marian weep, in the good way, the only way she wept now, for he had made by his own particular order a small fine plate of brass, engraved with her true name, and beneath it, in tiny precise notation, the 4 notes of her signing motif, the cipher of her name, and he had it set into the lid of her mother's worn traveling clavitured, the homely whisper-toned box that had carried her father's last gift and her own buried truth safe through all those years, so that the instrument that had kept her name hidden in the dark until there was at last someone to hear it should carry that name now in the open, in honest metal, where the dull old brass band had been, the name on the lid, and the same name sung in the music, no longer hidden at all. And on the long light evenings, in the fine music room of Thornleigh that was hers again, the worn traveling clavichord would stand open on its table beside her, its mended soundboard sitting true at last, the hidden space beneath it empty now, the will and the letter and the cipher key long since done their work and laid up safe with Mr. Wakely, and nothing left inside it but her father's worn ebony tuning fork and, set bright into the lid. Her own name in honest brass with its 4 small notes, and the cold Earl, who was not cold at all, would come and stand behind her chair and set his hand on her shoulder and listen to her play. Listen to the true voice he had loved before he ever loved the woman lay down its honest line of music in the light, and sometimes, in the quiet, when she came to the place in some new song where she had woven, as she still always did, the 4 notes of her name. No longer to hide it now, but only because it was hers, and because her father had taught her so, he would lean down smiling, and sing the 4 notes softly against her ear, her own name in the music, and she would laugh, in her own free unlocked voice, and play it again for him, the name no longer hidden beneath anything at all. For this in the end was the truth the old whisper-toned box had carried all along, folded beneath the proof and the law and the fortune. And it is the truth I leave with you tonight. A true voice cannot be silenced. However the grasping and the cold may shut a mouth and forge a deed and sell its music under a fairer name, and a name sung into the music itself, kept faithful in the dark against a long cruelty, cannot be scraped from the page, but will rise again to the one who has the heart to truly listen and find it. So I will ask you, before the candle gutters, when the cold hands of the world would silence your truest voice and sell what you made under another's name, will you be the one who lets it stay buried for the sake of a quiet life, or the one who sings the truth down anyway, somewhere in the dark of the work, and trusts that it will keep until the morning someone listens, and so the candle burns low on another tale? Stay a while in the quiet, and tell me in the comments whether she chose rightly.